That's not true at all. In their haste to develop this VR game and clear their name, they sent us some things I don't think they intended us to see, such as a hard drive containing emails between Fazbear Entertainment and a certain indie developer. Fazbear Entertainment hired the game developer. Those indie games were designed to conceal and make light of what happened. This isn't just an attempt to rebrand. It's an elaborate cover-up, a campaign to discredit everything.
We are all sitting in a canyon. A ginormous canyon of time that feels like it stretches on forever and ever until Steel Wool announces the next FNAF game. But what is it truly that we want from this franchise? And are we exactly ready yet for another game to introduce new characters, new lore, a new storyline that could shake everything we've known about FNAF? And that leads to this question. Are the first 4 FNAF games made by Scott Cawthon canon to the FNAF story? Or as FNAF Help Wanted put it, the complete fabrications of a total lunatic? Today we're going to be going over the first 4 FNAF games in comparison with the new ones, and giving all of the perspectives on whether they are canon or not to the timeline. Starting in 2014, Scott Cawthon made 6 FNAF games that we all know and love today. FNAFs 1 through 4 was supposed to be the main story, and it was supposed to conclude at the end of 4. However, we all know that Scott had not intended this, and ended up making even more. He came out with FNAF Sister Location, FFPS, as well as Ultimate Custom Night. After FNAF UCN released, the whole entire franchise took a turn, a step that was new to everyone. It was announced that Scott Cawthon was going to be working in collaboration with Steel Wool Studios to release the very first FNAF VR game. And this game was going to be called FNAF Help Wanted. Now this sparked up some controversy within the fan base, as some believed that Scott Cawthon had ended the franchise perfectly and didn't really want to see a reboot for the franchise, although there was some of us, myself included, that was excited to be getting another FNAF game. And boy, did Steel Wool deliver on this one. Help Wanted has got to be one of my top favorite FNAF games, and the lore that this game had started pouring in from the beginning. On March 11th of 2019, Scott released the very first teaser for Help Wanted. It was a screenshot of what we later know would be the main poster for the game. However, we found something interesting within the picture itself. Little hidden messages giving us clues about the overall story that the franchise was heading. Remember, this is the first game from Steel Wool, and so all of the clues and lore that we find in Help Wanted can be tied into the rest of the game, such as Security Breach, Secret of the Mimic, and so forth and so on. This was the start of the character arc of the Mimic. We also found out there were links in the source code of the picture that gave us screenshots of gameplay from the VR game. It was starting to feel like that this game was going to be so much more than just a regular VR game. And it was then that on May 28th of 2019, FNAF VR Help Wanted was officially released to the public. And up until this point, FNAF had been a one-man indie series, but this was different. This was the moment the franchise took a massive turn, a turn that reshaped how we understand the entire FNAF timeline. At first, FNAF Help Wanted seemed to be a minigame mashup of remakes of all the original FNAF games. FNAF 1, FNAF 2, FNAF 3, even FNAF 4, as well as some new minigames such as parts and service locations, and a new villain that seemed to change the tone of FNAF. It's gotta be William Afton, even though at this point we know that it's gotta be the Mimic. Oh, we were so ignorant back in 2019. But there was one cutscene. A cutscene that changed the way everyone looked at the past FNAF games forever. And it wasn't buried somewhere deep within the code of the game. No, it was planted literally right when you booted it up. At the very start of the game, we are sitting on what appears to be a fun Fazbear Entertainment ride, and HandUnit welcomes us to a new virtual experience from Fazbear Entertainment. But he then goes on to tell us something interesting. He knows and says that in the eye of the public, Fazbear Entertainment has developed something of, well, a bad reputation over the past couple decades. And he goes on to say that some of the stories associated with their name were loosely based on real factual events. But then I quote, he says, "The majority of them were total fabrications from the mind of a lunatic, lawsuit pending." And literally freaking shows a picture of none other than Scott Cawthon himself. Something interesting that is worth noting here is that as we're riding this roller coasters, the pictures that are popping up as HandUnit is referring to these in-game FNAF games are literally screenshots of FNAF 4, FNAF 2, and even the logo of FNAF 1. So HandUnit goes on to say that Fazbear Entertainment is not above laughing at themselves, and goes on to say that's why they made this game, to basically scare the lies out of us, and to reset Fazbear Entertainment for a bigger and brighter future. In fact, if we look at where the franchise ends up going as Fazbear Entertainment, in the next game we have the Mega Pizzaplex, which is a massive undertaking for Fazbear Entertainment, and only would have been able to have been done with investors and a good look from the public. And so it's possible, whether or not it was through this VR game, Fazbear Entertainment was able to gain back some of the credibility from the public. However, that leaves us, the community, in a terrible predicament. How do we know 100% that Scott Cawthon's games that he created, which started everything, are they even canon to the FNAF lore? Because if they are not, that could mean that everything we've known about FNAF is a complete lie. Now, some of you might be asking, Mac, what exactly could it change? Well, let's just sit back and think. For instance, the MCI. We first learned about the MCI way back in 2014 from FNAF 1, from the newspapers that can be seen on the hallway cameras. We learned that 5 children were lured into a back room, were murdered by someone wearing a mascot costume, and from some of the hints from the newspapers, we assumed they were stuffed into the animatronics, which then began to hunt them. But that's just the thing. 95% of what we know about the MCI comes from FNAF 1. And if those games were created by an in-universe indie game developer, that would throw a big question mark on whether or not that's actually what took place there. Also, the whole idea of the existence of Golden Freddy would be called into question. I mean, after all, in Help Wanted and Security Breach, we didn't see anything of Golden Freddy ever. And what do you know, the games where we do see Golden Freddy would have been the ones that were created in-universe. That then would call into question the entire existence of the Crying Child, the Bite of 83, if this is something that again happened in the old games, and there's nothing really talked about it from the new ones. Did it even happen? As you can see, this starts to throw humongous monkey wrenches into the FNAF timeline. However, there's one more piece of evidence, something that, when added on top of everything I just said, starts to make this idea make sense, unfortunately. And that is one of the books from Tales from the Pizzaplex called Haps. And one of the short stories within this book is simply called Help Wanted. And it tells us the story about an indie game developer named Steve, who unfortunately is catfished by Fazbear Entertainment to create them video games. However, Steve turns them down for multiple reasons, one of which he doesn't really want to create horror games, but Fazbear Entertainment isn't over yet. They continue to catfish him again and eventually get him into the position to where they are basically mentally torturing him into creating the games that they've wanted for so long. And by torturing them, I mean playing super high-pitched sounds which cause him to hallucinate, seeing terrible monsters, which he then puts into his games. Unfortunately, it sounds a whole lot like sound illusion discs. Now, a lot of people have taken this story from this book as proof to show that this is actually what's taking place here. However, that is taking into consideration one big questionable idea. Is this story from Tales from the Pizzaplex canon? And at this point, I would say that Tales from the Pizzaplex are not canon, at least not all of them. And the main reason because of this was the release of Secret of the Mimic. You see, in Tales from the Pizzaplex, we had a story called The Mimic that told us about Edwin Murray and the creation of the Mimic animatronic. However, the way that we saw that happen in this story, The Mimic from Tales from the Pizzaplex, differs greatly compared to the actual game Secret of the Mimic, where we literally learn a ton about Edwin Murray and the Mimic. One quick way that the book varies from the game is the fact that in the book, Fiona, Edwin's wife, is supposed to have died in childbirth of David. However, in the game, Fiona dies by going to one of the Fall Fest events and dies in a fire. And so while I'm not saying that every single one of these stories is false, this just throws a big red flag on the entire series as a whole. And this isn't like Fazbear Frights, where Scott directly told us from a Steam post that some of the stories would be directly connected to the game. When Scott said that, he was referring to Frights, not Tales. And so that would be my biggest gripe about using the story Help Wanted for evidence of this theory. However, we do have to talk about the elephant in the room. The literal game Help Wanted said this. So then how do we explain it? Well, thankfully, Scott Cawthon made a Steam post shortly after the release of Help Wanted that I believe begins to shed some light on exactly what he was trying to get at. And so within this Steam post, Scott Cawthon says this: "The short answer is no. My name is never actually mentioned in the game. The game says an indie developer was tarnishing the brand of Fazbear Entertainment by making video games about them, forcing them to rebrand and try to reclaim their good name by making a VR game. That made light of those crazy stories. How do you take characters that are canon, along with characters that are questionably canon, and characters from every point of the timeline, and throw them all together in one game that is canon? That's quite the problem when you think about it. But it was important for me that Help Wanted meant something. I didn't want just a meaningless collection of minigames, although I'm sure most people would have been okay with that. I wanted it to be canon, and that meant I needed to solve the substantial puzzle of how. So no, I'm not canon, Fredin isn't canon, the fan games aren't canon, you aren't canon. Only the existence of a game developer that supposedly made video games based on actual events that may or may not be a cover-up by Fazbear Entertainment is canon." Did you just catch that last bit? Only the existence of the game developer that, here it is, supposedly made video games based on actual events. What? To me, it seems like through this Steam post, Scott is trying to help the community point us in a right direction. Because, well, we were starting to say that, oh, Scott Cawthon's canon to FNAF lore and that everything he's made is a complete lie, he stepped in with this post to give us a little bit of a different perspective on it. And for me at least, it's led to the conclusion of the fact that, yes, the indie game developer did exist, however, we've actually never seen the games that he created for Fazbear Entertainment. Remember how earlier I was talking about if we wanted to believe this that it would call into question the existence of Golden Freddy? Well, let's just think about something here. Golden Freddy doesn't show up anywhere within FNAF Help Wanted, and these minigames are most likely more one-to-one with the ones that the indie game developer created. Now, as we know, Golden Freddy carries a lot of the story from the original FNAF games. So it would seem strange for Fazbear Entertainment to simply just cut him from the games as a whole when making Help Wanted, the VR game. Which is possibly a clue to the fact that our games from Scott, like 2014's FNAF 1, is actually canon and real events that were playing out for the franchise, but the fact that Fazbear Entertainment made basically a copy game of that would be very similar to our FNAF game, but it was just a little bit different, for instance, excluding the idea of Golden Freddy. I really like this idea a lot. Not only does it explain the indie game developer from FNAF Help Wanted, but it also allows us to keep these original FNAF games from Scott canon in our own timeline. And the reason why this is important is because over the years we have drawn as the community a very strong line between what is canon and what is not canon. We've always said that the games are canon for their own timeline as to where the books are their completely own canonicity. But when we start to blur the line here and say, oh, well, guess what? This game from the FNAF franchise that we all thought was canon actually is not. When we start to blur that line, we start to blur facts. And simple things, like I mentioned, Golden Freddy and just the MCI overall start to fall apart. And those ideas are what make up the pillars of FNAF as a whole. And so even though I believe I've built a pretty definitive case for the fact that the first FNAF games are truly canon, there are still some details in which I have not brought up, one of which being sister location and Innard being in Help Wanted. The reason why this is a problem is because Innard really only would have been seen by most likely Michael and maybe a select few other people, and that's it. And Innard is important to the timeline because he was the carrier of all of the souls of the original MCI at one point, until then he turned into Molten Freddy. And so including Innard in Help Wanted is something very strange, and really a lot of people would say can only be explained by the fact that Sister Location was an in-universe FNAF game, not actually canon. And even though this is a very good piece of evidence, I think there is a way to answer this. It's important to remember that Help Wanted, the in-universe VR game, is not a documentary, it's a PR project. Fazbear Entertainment didn't build the game to tell the truth, they built it to rewrite their history and bury real events, replace rumors with official versions of characters, and in the meantime make themselves look innocent. This means that this VR game is not faithful of retelling of actual events. It's obviously a messy collage of leaked files and rumors, employee testimonies, internet conspiracy theories, and so forth and so on. And so, if we answer the question of how Innard gets into the game, it's not because Fazbear Entertainment created him as a character. No, it's because they had access to leftover Afton Robotics data. You see, one way they could have learned about Innard was from security cam footage from Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rentals. We obviously know that the facility has cameras, and it's possible that on camera, Michael Afton's death was captured, and they saw the entire scene of Innard and Michael and exactly what took place there. Also, eyewitness events of Michael actually being out in the real world as Innard was wearing his skin and it decayed over time. We obviously see from this cutscene that multiple people saw and knew something wasn't quite right with Michael. And so with that theory, I think it's safe to say that we don't always have to take exactly what we see in Help Wanted literally, but rather there are other ways to interpret the evidence. But to be completely honest, only time will tell, and I really hope that the next FNAF game from Steelwool will shed more light on this question and give us finally a definitive answer about it. But in the meantime, if you want to see a timeline breakdown of which animatronics were created first, check out this video right here. Make sure to subscribe for weekly horror, ARG, and FNAF videos. I hope you all enjoyed today's video. Have a fantastic day.